If a man is in the forest alone and he says something and no one can hear him, is he still wrong?
Where's your Post-it note?
If a man wears a black suit in the forest. Oh, shit.
All right, welcome to Trade seCREts. Excited to have you back. Hopefully you will give us a like or a heart or however you favorite things to follow on YouTube or Spotify or Apple. We really appreciate you out there listening, and we've got some exciting things in store today. The topic of the day is receiverships. But before we get into that, we're going to start off with a couple curveballs. First one is there is something in the set that's different, and anybody, or the first person, I say, not anybody, the first person who responds either to Kelsey or on YouTube and tells us what's different in the screen is going to get a free bottle of this guy. One that will be full. Not
You get 4 ounces of half-drink bottle of Buffalo Trace.
Not the 4-ounce version, but Buffalo Trace for sure. But you got to tell us what is different in the scene today. And then we're celebrating somebody's...
No.
Yes!
You got... Oh, my God.
Somebody's birthday today.
Birthday
To you. Oh, we got to light it. Happy birthday to you. Oh, happy birthday, dear Paige.
Thanks, guys.
Happy birthday to you.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate you.
Carrot cake, since you said you were over carrot cake.
I am very carrot caked out, but thank you. That's lovely.
Wow, you handled that way better than I expected.
The second you said curveballs, I knew that I was going to be in the spotlight for a minute there.
For a hot second.
Yeah.
Well, happy
But thank
birthday.
you. I appreciate it. It's
Happy
not a
birthday.
sombrero in a Mexican restaurant, so I'm fine.
Yeah.
That comes later.
Nope.
Yeah. So, no, happy birthday. We're excited to celebrate. And like I said, we're going to talk about receiverships over a bottle of Iron Smoke bourbon, which we'll get into in a little bit. But, yeah, receiverships in commercial real estate. It is going to be a topic, maybe a hot topic here over the next few months. There's a lot of looming foreclosures and or commercial loan defaults. That's like the headline in the Wall Street Journal. And, you know, the loan default itself, from my perspective anyway, isn't really anything that causes concern to the tenant. But the receivership process that maybe ensues potentially has some challenges, so figured we'd dig into that topic. And just for a little bit of background, it actually is the best cold calling letter / topic I've ever used in my career. One of our really dear clients started 15 years ago because of a receivership letter trying to explain what you're up against. So It's a topic that's near and dear to the success of cold calling in my personal career.
And it was a receivership, not a bankruptcy, correct?
Correct. Yeah, a portfolio of buildings in Cleveland was owned by the King Group, and they defaulted on their loan. 7 buildings, if my memory is any good. 15 years ago is quite some time. But we proceeded to send a letter to every single tenant in those 15 buildings, asking them basically 2 simple questions. Have you ever heard of receivership, and do you know what it means to you? If you don't, call us. And they did, shockingly. I think we got 4 or 5 phone calls out of it, which for those of you out there pounding the phones know that is a win. And one of them turned out to be what now has been a 15-year friend and client. It all started because of the topic of what's a receivership. So
what is a receivership?
Mr. Castle, you want to dig in?
Okay, a receivership is, I'm going to call it an off-ramp or a parallel path to a bankruptcy. A bankruptcy is...
They're not mutually exclusive, for sure.
They're kind of alike, but they're not the same. There's a commercial about that someplace. But a receivership is initiated by the creditor, okay? And it's to protect
In layman's terms, though, what's the creditor?
let's just say the bank in this case. But
Yeah,
it
so
could
the
also
bank
be
owns a commercial real estate building, like the building that we're in, for example, is
well, the bank
teetering on this
the
experience.
bank has a piece of debt against it, and what they're doing is they're protecting their asset prior to going into bankruptcy. Now, it gets really convoluted because I don't know the protections of what you get are completely nuanced. But basically, this is a method of trying not to go to bankruptcy, because bankruptcy is you've pushed the snowball over the hill. It is going downhill after that. This is an attempt to try to work things out, and it's initiated by the lender. And the lender basically petitions the court to appoint a receiver to operate the borrower's business.
I think that's the key fact, that it's an appointed person who now is in charge of the asset.
He is
whether
in charge
it's one
of the
building
asset.
or 10 buildings.
Okay, he is under the supervision of a court. He has to act as a fiduciary to the person who appointed him, I believe.
Creditor and
the creditor
and the court.
and the court, but not the borrower,
Yeah, not to the owner of the building.
to my understanding. So basically, he operates the asset, whether it's a business, whether it's a piece of real estate, whatever it happens to be, to try to upright it. And he has a lot of powers. He can do all sorts of things. He could enter into new leases. He could, I don't believe he cannot modify existing leases.
Yeah, that's one of
Okay.
the things we're going to get into for
The,
sure.
the lease
She could
is.
also be a woman.
Well, yes, Mike
Yes,
was using
yes.
in a nondescriptive way.
My pronouns are what an asshole. So it.
She gets a birthday cake, so she thinks she can
That's
throw
right. It's her birthday
throw mud.
cake, so she gets to toss cake at me by the end of the show.
No, I think we eat this cake. The throwing cakes elsewhere.
But it's very nuanced. But when something like this happens, you absolutely have to consult your legal counsel, and you absolutely should consult your real estate counsel, because
You're
there's a
saying
lot
that
of
the tenant should?
the tenant should,
Yeah.
because there's a lot of moving parts to it.
And I would say most often when a receiver gets appointed, the tenants, not maybe most often, that the receivership doesn't guarantee that the tenant even knows that it happened. I mean, in the case of the King Group situation, none of the tenants knew, because it's not a situation by way the tenants need to have been given notice, or the notice that they might have been given was an estoppel, which we can talk about, but most people don't even realize that the estoppel was caused by a receivership. So it's a really nuanced thing as the tenant.
Right, and I think downstream of that, you would have found out, because there would have been a new notice address as to where to send all of your rents, any building issues or anything like that. And one of the problems is that when you get into it, the tenancy issue is that sometimes one of the things that people do to save or cut down on expenses is to stop providing services.
Right.
And that can really affect the tenant's operation within any particular place like that. And it's from the landlord's perspective, for the owner's perspective, they should also have some serious counsel regarding this, because they are losing operational control of their asset.
But they still have the liability of the debt.
Absolutely.
So they're no longer making the decisions, but they are completely on the hook for the exposure.
Yeah, and this is the have your cake and eat it too, from the perspective of the lender. Because the last thing the lender wants to do is initiate the bankruptcy, because they end up with an asset down that they become responsible for, which is what they don't want to have happen.
Right.
Okay.
So I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
The first one is on a CMBS backed debt.
Commercial mortgage-backed security.
So
So that's where
there's a CMBS loan
Yeah,
on
let's
our
let's pause right there.
development.
So, borrower, owner of building, gets debt. That debt then gets sold off into what's called a commercial mortgage-backed security, which is a huge pool of other like-kind debt. And now you're no longer dealing with owner or lender. You're dealing with a buyer of debt, which is a loose way of explaining CMBS debt.
Sure. So if a CMBS backed development
Yep.
goes into financial distress,
Correct.
who appoints the receiver?
Okay, a receiver, under a situation like that, the entire piece of the security would have to be defaulted, I believe.
No, so what happens is the CMBS appoints what's called a special servicer. So CMBS debt is a big pool of debt. They put somebody in charge who's a master servicer, who basically is the third party who collects all the rents, makes sure everything's going okay. When things aren't going okay, to your point, and it starts to go into financial distress, then they get appointed a special servicer. And
The special servicer typically is within the actual lending institution.
or a third party that they control.
Right, the master, I believe, would be the third party.
Yeah.
Was the CMBS scenario one of those ones that we probably shouldn't have ventured into?
No, it's the one that's probably the most complicated because
Yeah.
'Cause
the
it's this-
special servicer and the receiver are similar in nature enough that it is a little, confusing.
Yeah. So
But
receivership
same concept.
generally.
Special servicer now takes control of said asset and is in charge of all things. May or may not appoint a actual receiver, but the concept of receivership has happened because there's somebody else now in control of the building whose only objective is to maximize the likely return on the debt holders.
To
So,
protect
their-
the debt holder.
Yeah.
And you get a kind of default for a mortgage has all sorts of moving parts too. You could be paying your mortgage and your property can go into default. And we're about to see a number of these things. Because within the mortgage, you have to have certain ratios and limits. There has to be a debt coverage ratio. There has to be a loan to value ratio. And now with you have diminishing values, okay, and not enough cash flow to cover them, you could be in default, but you're paying you're paying your note. And a lot of these times, this is the bank's way of saying nicely, I'm going to default on you, roll out of this loan, refinance this someplace else.
If it's a good partner lender, meaning the good partner lender, to Michael's point, you could be totally current, just like if this is your home mortgage. You could be paying your home mortgage. You have every right to stay in your home. But there could be an outcome that's happening in the universe that you have no control over that puts you in default. And your lender, if they're a good partner, will say, hey, I put you in default because it protects my rights. But what I really want you to do is just go refinance this. And if you go refinance it, then it's, no harm, no foul. If you have a bad lender partner, and we won't name names, but there's definitely some banks out there who are notorious for being good lender partners or bad lender partners, they would put you in default and say, no, we're actually going to call your loan and you need to figure it out and figure it out instantly, which effectively creates a business opportunity for the likes of Scott and others who have a lot of liquidity and can step in and solve messy problems.
And there's a process that has to be followed there, and it's typically time deltas when you go into, they notify you you're going into special assets, which sounds really nice, but it's really bad.
It's the opposite
Okay,
of
it's
special.
you don't feel special after these things. It's okay. So they say you're going into special assets, and then they just continue to add all these layers of responsibilities to you, and in many cases, they have the opportunity to increase your interest rates, which can crucify you. It's a terrible thing to go through.
So receivership is essentially like turnaround management for real estate. So if a business is failing, they can bring in turnaround management to try to keep it from bankruptcy, to slipping into bankruptcy. Receivership is kind of like what the equivalent of that in a real estate situation.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And I think one of the frustrating things is the receiver is really incentivized. Like if you're talking about how people get incentivized, the receiver itself, even if they're the best human in the world, male, female, it doesn't matter. The reality is they're incentivized to keep it in receivership for as long as possible because they get paid a fee based on the fact that they're in control of the property and they are the receiver.
And they don't get a success fee if they successfully pull it out of that.
I think that there are cases where there is a success fee, but it is typically by way of they also have a real estate brokerage company that gets the disposition fee or something like that. But make no mistake about it, while it's in receivership, the fees that they're charging are beneficial to the receiver and to the receiver only.
Yeah, and keep in mind that the receiver is appointed by the court.
So they're
Okay,
so
they're either
a
appointed by the
receiver-
court or the bank.
A receivership really is just to stabilize the asset. It's not to turn around and revert it to the previous owner then really. It's just to stabilize the asset, to minimize the losses to the creditor, or to try to make the creditor as whole as possible with a disposition. So they stabilize it in order to be able to sell it at or above the outstanding debt to the creditor.
Yeah, it's actually a great question. I'd love to fact check that. We won't get it done here on this call or on this podcast, but how many times it actually reverts back to the original owner? I bet it's a very, very low percentage. It's not impossible, but it's definitely a low percentage. It is
So
not.
it's usually just stabilize and then sell it off.
And
Stabilize and or improve
Or-
value by making better decisions. I mean, if the owner of the building, not the lender, but the owner is just a bad manager or a bad business person and is making, decisions that decrease value or anger tenants or whatever the case might be, the receiver might step in and actually say like, oh, if we would have done these 3 things differently, now all of a sudden this building's making money and we're in a much better place.
Yeah. Whereas it's interesting in the current climate where there's speculation of office buildings that will or already are falling into receivership, like special servicing receivership. But it's not necessarily just bad management. It's a whole host of environmental conditions, we'll call them, that make it very difficult to lease up these assets. Specifically, you hear it all the time, like the CBD office towers. So
But that's
how
as
does
well.
that play out? I mean, will everything just be in like receivership forever? Because
it
if you
can go
can't,
on for
if
an
it,
extended
like at what
period
point
of
in time, if it goes into receivership and a receiver is not able to improve the value of the asset, then what happens? Then the bank just comes to own it. It goes.
The bank could come to own it.
And
Okay,
then the bank just owns a bunch of vacant or
The
nearly
court could
vacant
step
assets.
in.
And
The court could step in and say this is going nowhere. The owner of the property could go file for bankruptcy and the protections associated with that. There's a number of different avenues that could occur, but that could easily have happened. And, when we're talking about this, everything that we think that is about to be, let's just call it distressed property, you have all sorts of moving parts there. You have people starting to work from home. You have less occupancy. You have higher cost of operation, higher taxes, higher interest rates. You have loans that are rolling. You have banks in their portfolio that want to get rid of their real estate assets, specifically CBD properties. So there's a lot of external factors that kind of cause this. And that mortgage document that you have that has all these little, if this happens, we can do this. If this happens, we can do this. If this happens, we can do this. And that's where you start getting a lot of these defaults. And the defaults build on one another because it's not the only guy that would default.
Right. And obviously I think we could go down a bunch of different rabbit holes as the borrower and or the creditor or the landlord. But I think, to bring it back to where we started, which was how does this impact the tenant? The tenant usually doesn't even know most of this is going on until it comes time to renew their lease, or there's something broken and they need it fixed.
The services of the building become non-existent.
I was in a building a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, that was in receivership, talking to a tenant who wasn't sure if they wanted to renew their lease or go somewhere else. And I had to wait 5 minutes to get an elevator up to their floor. And then once I got in their office, we had our meeting. I was leaving, and they said, "Oh, you might just want to take the stairs." They're like, the only one of the elevators works. And this is a massive office tower with
I think 12.
8
I
or
think
10, 12 elevators.
Yeah, I think 12.
A lot, and only, maybe then it wasn't one, but it was basically like 20% of the elevators in the building were working. And they said that they have repeatedly gotten stuck in the 2 that do, or the however many that did. So their staff had been taking the stairs up and down from like the 5th to the 7th floor.
Yeah, imagine if you're on the 30th or 80th
Right.
or 100th floor of a high-rise
Right.
in Manhattan or Chicago or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just thought it was bad. I don't think they even knew that the property was in receivership. They thought that it was just being neglected.
Right.
Because it was downtown in the midst of COVID.
Well, if you're not paying the lender, there's a fairly decent chance there's a number of other vendors you're not paying also.
Yeah.
And after
The
point in time,
elevator
they're
guy's
going-
pretty high up on the list of the first to get.
Well, they typically bill quarterly, so
Well,
they just could be caught up, and they'll carry you for X period of time, but then they'll cut you off from service.
Yeah, and I mean, it's an interesting, the elevator kind of rabbit hole. It doesn't even necessarily need to be receivership or a lender issue. If you own a building and you want all the tenants to leave, the fastest way to make them disgruntled is make the elevator stop working.
Mhm.
I mean, we worked on a project in Cleveland at one point where we had a tenant who thought that being the last tenant left in a building that was for surely going to become residential would give them the most amount of leverage possible. And boy, did they learn the hard way that being the last tenant left in a 25-story building is a really uncomfortable experience because the landlord can make your life really, really, really uncomfortable. And receivers, just to make sure we're drawing lines in the sand between the two of those stories, the receiver typically is not trying to make the tenant's life miserable. They're usually trying to solve a situation rather than create one.
Mm-hmm.
But sometimes their hands are tied because they only have so many dollars and they got to pick where the dollars go.
Yeah, and the receiver acts on behalf of the creditor, so at some point in time, the creditor is not going to give any more money.
So
No.
if you're a tenant in a building that goes into receivership, but your lease isn't coming up for immediate renewal, is this a scenario that would likely impact, other than obviously like certain services falling by the wayside, but you're locked in for, call it another 5 years, what leverage do you have as a tenant with a lot of term left if your building falls into receivership? Or do you just kind of have to deal with that until hopefully they get more tenants in and solve their problem?
That's a great question.
I think the answer is even worse than that,
Yeah.
because a lease is an interest in time, so you're there. You've committed to that, and as a receiver acting on behalf of the creditor, saying the last thing we want to have happen is for you to stop paying your rent.
But there are some things you can do as a tenant before you're in that position. Problem is, once you're in it, you're in it. So you need to have thought about it before you got there, which is why we always recommend hire really good real estate legal expertise, not just lawyers. No disrespect to non-real estate lawyers, but nothing is worse than when we have a client who says, yeah, my friend who practices family law is going to read our lease. It's like, please, God, no. Get a real estate attorney. Because there's some things you can put into your lease document that help prevent a situation where you have no rights. One of the concepts, and this is kind of a two-way street, so most sophisticated landlords want it as well as tenants. It's called an estoppel certificate. So if there's a change in control or a change in ownership of the asset, usually the tenants get a document that says, here, I want you to confirm that everything is hunky-dory and that you've got no issues.
So you can hold out on signing the estoppel until they fix, or
You
until they...
you can't really hold up, because as long as the landlord has made reasonable efforts to make you sign it, that, That really is what it is.
But it's
then
your
how is
chance.
that a tool to-
It's your chance to tell the future ownership or future controlling
Yeah.
interest. Here are my beefs with the current
Yes.
landlord, and until you solve them or make the good faith efforts to start the solving, I'm not going to agree that my lease is intact, which is another way of saying, hey, I think that the landlord's in default. I want out.
So when a receiver is appointed, that is considered a change in control, and they would need to distribute estoppels to their tenants.
Typically, estoppel certificates would go out at that moment in time because the receiver wants to find out. A good receiver wants to know, where are the bodies buried? What's going on?
In addition to that, they would use the estoppel as a validation that, yes, I do have a lease in place, and this is what I'm supposed to be doing on my end.
Yeah, because the two-way street is the receiver's getting appointed to ensure the health or the return of the finances to the creditor, and they want to make sure, if there's 10 tenants here, how many of them are going to keep paying the rent? Because if 8 of them won't sign their estoppel certificates because they're going to say, Joe, the owner of the building, was a jerk, and now that I know he's not here, I'm not going to pay anymore. It's an interesting document, but I would encourage any tenant out there, before you sign a lease, make sure that your lease says if there's going to be a change of control, not only are you going to get an estoppel certificate, but you're going to have a window of time, 10, 14 business days, to actually think about it and respond to it.
That's kind of crazy. I mean, do you think that this is gonna, because we are in a time period where there's a lot of speculation about buildings going into special servicing or receivership, but you have some companies that are in 80,000 square feet of space and their names are on the tops of these buildings. Maybe the rest of the building is vacant. That could go into receivership, but they're locked into a 40-year lease or 20. Do you think we're going to start to see
Don't sign 40-year leases.
companies take
News
like
alert.
whole buildings so that stuff doesn't happen, so that they can be more in control of their destiny, or larger companies, even if they have a massive footprint, not committing for the term lengths that they used to commit to, just so that if the landlord goes bankrupt, that they aren't stuck in a building with 20% of the elevators functioning.
I mean, I've got a thought, but I'll let you go.
Well, it's, first of all, this is not the first financial crisis that we're facing. Okay, we've been through this before. It really didn't affect things and change the behavior of tenants and what they're going to do.
Yeah, but I think this is COVID where people didn't want to work. You know, the introduction now of a hybrid or remote compiled with the financial fallout from that. So I think it's compounding issues. It's not just a financial crisis. There's been a shift in the way people work, and now that has in part helped add to the financial crisis that landlords face.
It's added fuel to the real fire, which is that the ability to borrow money has changed drastically, which is really
there's
what's
not that many
causing this.
people. There's no longer still the same demand for as much office space too.
Right. I think that's the fuel. I think the real fire is that if you own a building today, your cost to borrow money compared to 12 months ago or 18 months ago is doubled. So your building could be 100% full. I mean, this happened to good friends and partners of mine. I mean, they had a portfolio of Class A office space in the Cleveland market that was 97% occupied, 0 tenants in default. The savings and loan crisis hit, borrowing rates went up, their debt service coverage ratio changed, and their lender, who's not a good lender to be in partners with, said, "You're in default, game over," and took the buildings back. In a situation where the tenants were paying their rent, the landlord was doing what they were supposed to be doing, but the world outside changed. And I think what's looming on the horizon for the commercial real estate market is more indicative of the Fed and interest rates than it is a COVID issue. I think the COVID issue is specific to buildings, like one-off buildings, but the reality of interest rates changing and borrowing appetite changing, because I think there's some lenders who are just like, we're not lending, we don't care. Like, I don't care what the rate is, I'm not going to lend on a commercial real estate asset. I think that's really the fuel. Or
I
I'm sorry, the fire.
think lenders go through that,
Yeah.
that product type scenario all the time. 1 minute, limited service hotels are the flavor of the month, and then it's full service hotels, and then it's downtown office buildings and AAA product and, whatever. It's just the banks change their mind constantly about what is supposed to be filling up their portfolio.
But
Going back to the S&L
Return.
crisis, to me, that was the most disastrous to the commercial real estate market, because the banks that actually lended on these, the banks were gone. They failed. There was a time after deregulation where savings and loans were allowed to get into provide mortgages for office buildings, and so they were literally giving away money. I don't mean it, theoretically, but they were lending to everybody, Tom, Dick, and Harry, and it just created this incredible oversupply. And then to solve that, the government backed that, and they created, remember the Resolution Trust Corporation, which was, I guess, as close to a government-funded receiver as you could get. They created this entity to dispose of the assets. And you had buildings that were 100% occupied, that the RTC was just basically, we've taken the property back, it's our property right now, we're just disposing of this. And you had also a lot of vacant properties too, tons of vacant properties, and they were giving away the property for 10 cents on the dollar.
Yeah. I was going to say, back to Paige's original question, I think the bigger tenant, or I should say the bigger the tenant, the more sophisticated the tenant in all likelihood. And I think that they've made a conscious choice, a strategic choice that is either I want to own my own real estate so that I can have control because of all of these potential risks, or they've decided I'm willing to understand the risks. I feel like I can protect myself against them, and I still want to be a tenant because I think that the risks of ownership are worse. And in those sophisticated tenants, 80,000 feet, 200,000 feet, whatever the case may be, they now have a lease document that gives them other tools on top of estoppel that make them feel like they're protected in a way that during the course of their occupancy, even if the borrower, the landlord, loses his financial footing, that they're in a position that they can enforce. And in some cases, one of the concepts
So
is
just like a
a
landlord
right to cure
default.
or a self-help.
Self-cure.
Yeah, like there's a lot of tools out there that can force the landlord into default and then put the tenant in a position of having a lot more say in how things happen.
And it's good to point out the size differential too. If you're a 5,000-foot tenant, you're never going to be able to get a very attractive bankruptcy clause in your favor. Okay, if you're 100,000
Or a landlord default clause.
or a landlord default clause, you're these are the things. If you're a single tenant, if you're an Amazon taking down a huge warehouse, you're going to get every clause that you want for the most part.
Yeah, I would say the bigger the tenant. So there's landlord default and tenant default. We usually talk about tenant default.
Yeah.
And it's usually a much longer list in the lease. But if you're a really big tenant with a lot of sophistication, all of a sudden the lease looks a lot more fair. And there's a lot of bullet points that say, hey, landlord, if you do X, Y, or Z, you're now in default. And now you as the tenant have the right to either cure, like I said, or walk. And if you've got the right to walk from your lease, and the receiver knows that, the receiver is going to be extremely diligent about ensuring that you don't walk and that he gets that building out of default so that he still has the revenue from that tenant. Does that make
Right.
sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And who are the people that become receivers? Are there companies are there national brand, national offices that are, the known people in the market to become receivers in the Northeast and the South?
Yeah, I want to be agnostic to names because I don't want to give anybody props.
But like, are there
on the special
3-4
servicer,
large
yes,
nationwide?
on the special servicer side of the world, so the CMBS driven receivership process, there are major companies with thousands of employees who that is their jam, and they do it really well. They do it all over the country. Which is one of the risks as a tenant, is if you're in a building that gets put into special servicing by a group that's not local to your market, you now have a problem because your special servicers clearly not somebody you're having dinner with, clearly not somebody you know from the club, and clearly not somebody who understands your local market. So that creates friction. In the non-CMBS world, so the more local lender experience, and especially in a town like Pittsburgh, you have some real estate professionals, brokers, agents, and real estate lawyers who have figured out, you know what, this is a really interesting niche. I'm only going to do this. I'm going to become a receiver. I'm going to let every judge in town know that I am a receiver. And you start to get to a point where, you know, you become one of very few people on a list of, hey, here's an office building in Pittsburgh. How many names are actual receivers? And it's a pretty short list.
So is it finance background people? Is it legal background people?
Legal
is
background.
it real estate background people? Okay.
I actually think it can be.
Could be all of the above.
It depends
but-
on the asset, first of all. Okay, it depends on the location.
Yeah, I
You know.
understand their variables. I just wasn't sure. Like,
I'd say legal first, real estate second, finance third.
Yeah, and it's and it also goes back to the person who can initiate the receivership is either the borrower and or the court. You can petition the court for a receivership, and it goes back to who's the best one to solve that problem.
Yeah, on the local level, on the non-CMBS thing,
Mhm.
I bet if you pulled the curtain behind the scenes, the receivers have a tendency to go to dinner with judges, go to cocktails and country clubs with judges, and they have insulated themselves into a really small network. No different than, you know, we've
Anything
created
else,
a
yeah.
niche for what we
Yeah,
do,
sure.
and
Mhm.
they've created their niche. They get really good at it, and the judges know if we appoint, you know, John Smith will get it taken care of for us. So it's a fascinating topic. We're certainly going to see a lot more of it.
And you're going to see a lot more of it, as well as the parallel path to that would be bankruptcies also.
yeah. So if a property gets bought out of receivership, does it still need to go before the court, and does it still go to an auction, or no? Before the court, yes, but no auction.
That's a really good question. I don't
Before
know
the
the
court,
answer.
yes, no auction.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that the court can, and the receiver can make that decision.
They can make a unilateral
Yeah.
decision. Usually the court, that's a really good question. Not just on sale, but on decisions of, should I pay the elevator bill or the gas bill?
Mhm.
Should I renew a lease? Do I have any money to give the tenant for carpet or paint? Usually the court will say to the receiver, here are the 10 things you're allowed to do without coming to talk to me. And here's the list of things that you have to come talk to me about. And, you know, that list where the breaking point is on the bullets is also back to the tenant. Like, can I actually get a decision made by the guy who's in control of the building, or do I have to wait for it to go in front of a judge?
Right.
So I would say 9 times out of 10, they have the ability to sell it at a certain price without the court's.
I think that a sale has to be approved by the court, but it might not require a court judgment. Now, we get into a legal aspect of something like
but
that.
it's not a thing where it goes to bid.
No.
Like a bankruptcy does. Like there's
Not
like
in
a
general.
Yeah.
30 to 45 day window where they have to post a
they would
notice
have
of
to
a
post
hearing.
it, and
But you're saying that you
That's a
don't do
different-
that
yeah,
with
correct.
receivership.
Yeah.
It's just with
Receivers
bankruptcy.
usually have the ability to sell an asset at a certain number with the court's final blessing, and then somewhere below that number, the court can still agree to it, but the receiver's got to convince them to do it.
Mhm.
It's almost
Yeah.
like a really sophisticated real estate agent who is helping the court work through a whole bunch of complicated problems.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff goes back to the actual loan instrument, like the mortgage document, and those are incredibly complex
They're so
documents.
much fun to read. Come on.
Oh, yeah, they're the best.
They're the best.
I still haven't met someone who's actually read one.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Yeah.
I've read mine word for word.
Shout out to Alan. I bet Alan reads every word.
I bet Alan does.
He probably finds typos.
But it also gives there is incredible power in what the lending institution is allowed to do to increase the pressure to make you go someplace else.
Right.
You know, when you get that notice that your loan is going into special servicing, that's literally I'm going to break up with you and it's going to be really ugly. So find a new girlfriend right now. Because
And guess what? It's already too late because I'm already in control.
well, a lot of times, typically when that's going
and we put it in the paper that
But
this
when,
was
okay,
happening.
when you
So now all
do
the
that,
tenants know.
they're not doing it because times are good. They're doing it because times are bad.
Right.
You know, it used to be that every time a loan would roll over, there was another 10 lenders ready to jump right in. But now it's when you get a situation like this, no commercial lender wants to be in the downtown CBD.
Office
Space.
world right now.
You know, it's a very interesting thing, and it does have that trickle down because at the end of the day, the tenant is the cash flow instrument, and the tenant is the one that's going to have all of their services,
Gone.
at risk.
So if you're a tenant, bottom line, and you're in a building that you find out is in or going into receivership, you might want to call somebody like a Totum or your lawyer because there's lots to talk about. So
I think you call both, but let me just add one thing. Like anything else, it's a disruption, and all disruptions there is a risk and there's a tremendous opportunity. And as long as you know the moving parts within it, that's where you can make the right decision.
yeah, I mean, I will end with you make a great point. If you're a tenant who is sophisticated and you're in a building where you have substantial clout, meaning i.e. you control a lot of the revenue stream, and you become best friends with the receiver, you can probably create some serious leverage for your organization to ensure that the future of your home is protected and you're kind of in control, even though you're not in control. So, with that, we've got to thank the Stums, Eddie, and Leanne for a fantastic bottle of bourbon. They brought it last week for a company party, which we're so grateful to them and others who thought it would be fun to stock up the shelf. So what's the take, Vanna?
Okay, well, I thought it was a little harsh when we first started. This is a
Smoky. Harsh is not the word I use.
Iron smoke. This is a single barrel special reserve. It's made with applewood smoked wheat mash, and I think it opened up nicely. And unlike
I want to know where they got it.
New York,
I know, but how the
Okay.
hell did they get it like that? That's definitely not at the state liquor store.
yeah, I think this was probably a.
Well, didn't the
A
Stums
trip.
also give us the Old Soul, which none of us had ever seen either?
But unlike
That was from
Paige,
their son, who
Their son, yeah.
was down in Mississippi.
this is only 2 years old.
Oh, that's a great birthday pun, but I love it. We got to
So-
dig into that cake.
I'm
I-
22.
I actually,
I thought it was 21.
yeah, I liked it.
22 is more responsible. I'm going to go with that.
Okay.
It's worth at least
Not that I
another
was
glass.
responsible at either of those
So.
ages.
Iron smoke.
Nice.
Well, like us, love us, follow us on your app of choosing. Happy birthday to Paige, even though she didn't partake in the bourbon today.
No.
She was a little fearful of the
No, yeah.
bourbon. Wasn't feeling it today.
I think there's just been maybe too much partaking of hard liquor lately. I needed to step it down for a few days.
And remember,
tis the event season.
tis the event
so
season. Get out there and do some BD.
that's all I have been doing.
So again, reminder: if you notice what's different in the set, send us a message. First one in gets the bottle of Buffalo Trace. And thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.
These lights are